The past year has been an ominous time for the global newspaper industry. In the United States, mastheads that have published the news for more than a century are falling into bankruptcy, going online or closing down altogether. While the global financial meltdown has hit newspapers hard, some argue the rise of the internet and the subsequent collapse of classified ad revenue poses a fundamental threat to the viability of the business model that has sustained big city newspapers for centuries. Australia is facing the same challenge, as Thea de Chaos reports.
This is an absolutely crucial moment in the history of information.
The business model that has sustained newspapers for all these years is broken.
It's a dire prediction, but across the world the global financial crisis is shaking the foundations of newspapers which have been bringing the news to their readers for more than a century. In the United States alone, during the past 6 months, the publisher of the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune has filed for bankruptcy, while even the New York Times has reported record losses. It's prompted a US Senate committee inquiry into the future of journalism.
High-end journalism is dying in America, and unless a new economic model is achieved, it will not be reborn on the web or anywhere else.
In the United Kingdom, author and award-winning journalist Nick Davies is concerned by reports that more than 50 local and regional newspapers have closed in the past year.
There are newspapers merging, and even within those newspapers which are continuing, there are journalists being sacked.
Big city newspapers have traditionally relied on advertising, particularly classifieds, to employ hundreds of journalists. While the global recession has seen a dramatic drop in ad revenues, what has many observers worried is the steady leaching of content and advertising to the internet.
Over the last 3 or 4 decades, big corporations moved in, bought up newspapers and ransacked them for profit, which means that they cut the staff and increased the output, made a lot of money, but there was no spare fat left on the bone.
I think we will see newspapers with us for many years, providing, as ever, we as publishers can keep the quality of our titles.
In Australia, the industry body says predictions of the death of newspapers are premature, citing significant differences between the newspaper market here and overseas.
UK is 700 miles long, 150 miles wide. It's got 14 daily newspapers. I mean, it's, by definition, it's very difficult for those newspapers to get very high, very strong penetration of their markets. So in Australia and indeed in New Zealand, where I also have experience, you don't have those issues.
While Fairfax declined to be interviewed for this story, former Fairfax editor Eric Beecher believes the nation's oldest broadsheets, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, are now vulnerable.
Fairfax, in the last few days, have confirmed that those 2 newspapers are barely making a profit. It was a couple of years ago, between them, they were probably making a couple of $100 million a year profit.
Now running his own online publishing business, Eric Beecher argues the Fairfax empire has been too heavily reliant on classified advertising revenue, the so-called rivers of gold, which are now flowing onto the internet.
Well, I think News Limited is dealing with it far, far more intelligently. I mean, News Limited has a proprietor who loves newspapers and has worked in them all his life, and that's in stark contrast to Fairfax.
I think people who think that the internet is responsible for the death of newspapers are searching around and blaming the wrong person. Poor management, poor newspapers, I think are responsible for the death of some newspapers.
Yeah, with this decline, I think it worked very well.
Unlike Fairfax, News Limited has the advantage of a 70% share of the Australian newspaper market. Editorial Director Campbell Reid argues News Limited has a more diverse mix of display, retail and classified advertisements.
Many of the newspapers that are under serious threat don't have all of that mix. They rely incredibly heavily on classifieds, or they have no classifieds and display businesses. And we have all 3.
But the economic downturn has hit News Corp's global newspaper empire hard. Last quarter, profit collapsed by more than $267 million.
There is no doubt the traditional newspaper business model has to change.
Rupert Murdoch now says the age of free online newspaper content is over, and News is considering variations on the paid online subscription version of the Wall Street Journal.
In order to get people to pay for something, you have to offer a better service. And that's what we're focusing on. How do we take what we do now, make it better, and package it and make it available in such a way that people say, you know what, I would pay for that.
In the United States, some titles like the Seattle PI have gone exclusively online. At the recent US Senate inquiry into the future of journalism, the proposition was put that all newspapers should be able to charge for internet copyright.
The internet is a marvelous tool, and clearly it is the information delivery system of our future, but thus far it does not deliver much first-generation reporting. Instead, it leaches that reporting from mainstream news publications. In short, the parasite is slowly killing the host.
David Simon is screenwriter of the critically acclaimed TV series Wire. He's a former journalist with the Baltimore Sun, which he says endured cutback after cutback in journalist ranks, even when it was making a 30% profit.
So well before the arrival of the internet, as veteran reporters and homegrown editors took buyouts, news beats were dropped and less was covered with rigor or complexity.
And the other thing we obviously need to do is...
It's another day at the Australian newspaper headquarters in Sydney. In the morning, the editorial staff are shaping the paper, which employs 300 journalists around the country. Some experts argue that so-called citizen journalists or bloggers on the internet can't match this level of coverage or informed analysis.
What you haven't got is citizen journalists covering the courts, or the government departments, or the police, or the hospitals, or the schools, or doing investigations. There's a massive swathe of news when citizen journalists can't do the job because they don't have the skills, or the time, or the resources.
There is no model online to fund journalism that's produced by hundreds and hundreds of journalists. And so, yes, you're right, we're in a sort of state of great flux. Everyone is grasping for what the model might be.
Eric Beecher has a controversial proposal that government should subsidise quality journalism for the good of democracy.
It's much more like the other pillars of our democracy, like the parliament or the courts, or indeed like the arts and culture, which is actually heavily funded by government. And maybe it has to move in that direction.
There can be no serious consideration of public funding for newspapers. High-end journalism can and should bite any hand that tries to feed it, and it should bite a governing hand most viciously.
As the afternoon deadline looms, the pressure in the newsroom rises, and the day will not end until late in the evening when the presses begin to roll. Are newspapers going to be around for the next 10, 15 years?
Absolutely.
20 years?
Absolutely.
30?
Yeah.
50?
Yeah.
Even as News Limited rationalises its newspaper production in Queensland, a move which will result in an unspecified number of redundancies, Campbell Reid remains adamant the presses will continue to roll.
There's a sweet spot about a newspaper, printed on newspaper, in your hand that people like, so we aren't even going to contemplate turning them off.
Well, for one, I hope he's right. See you to chaos with that report.